I never imagined that one normal morning could erase 63 years of careful living, because it didn't start with panic or fear, it started with habit, the kind you build over a lifetime, waking up early making tea. Sitting at the same kitchen table where I had sat with my husband for decades, the house was quiet like it always was after he passed, quiet but familiar, safe even. I remember thinking how grateful I was that at least money was one thing I never had to worry about. I wasn't rich, but I was secure, and at my age, security feels like winning, so after breakfast I opened my laptop. Not because I was anxious, not because I suspected anything, just routine, just checking my bank account like I did once every few weeks. And that's when something felt wrong, not dramatic wrong, not movie-style wrong, just off. Like when a word is spelled wrong and your brain pauses. I refreshed the page once, then again, haha. I even closed the browser and reopened it because I honestly thought my eyes were tired, but the number didn't change, it stayed there. Cold and silent, and suddenly my chest felt tight, not pain exactly, more like pressure. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting like that would help. My balance was showing a little under $30,000. And my mind immediately said, no, that's not right, that can't be right, because just weeks ago it was close to 200,000, money I had saved slowly, carefully, penny by penny, over decades. Money my husband left behind so I would never have to depend on anyone, and for a moment, just a moment, I convinced myself I was confused. Old people do that, right? Haha, forget numbers, mix things up. I actually laughed out loud at myself, shook my head, whispered, get it together, and refreshed again, but the number didn't move, it just sat there mocking me, and that's when my hands started shaking, not violently, just enough to notice. Just enough to make the mouse feel heavier than it should, and before I could even process what I was seeing, my phone buzzed on the table. The sound made me jump, which is ridiculous because it was just a text. But something in my body already knew. I picked up the phone slowly, like delaying it might change what I was about to read. And there it was from my son, one short message, no greeting, no warmth, no hesitation, just words. Tomorrow I'm getting married and leaving. Live however you want. Bye. I read it once, then again, then a third time, and I didn't cry. That surprises people when I tell them this. But I didn't cry, I didn't scream either, I didn't call him, I didn't reply. I just sat there staring at the screen while my heart beat so loudly I could hear it in my ears, thump, 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 each beat asking the same question. How could he do this? How could my own son take everything and say goodbye like I was already dead? My throat tightened, my eyes burned, but I swallowed it all down, because something strange happens when shock hits deep enough. Emotions don't explode. They freeze. I remember looking around my kitchen, the same fridge, the same clock ticking, the same sunlight coming through the window. Everything looked normal, and that somehow made it worse. Because my world had cracked open and the universe didn't even blink, and in that silence 1,000 memories rushed in, holding his hand when he was little, cheering at his graduation, helping him with his first apartment. Telling myself that love meant giving, always giving, and now here I was, 71 years old, sitting alone, reading a goodbye text from the child I trusted more than anyone. I felt stupid, I won't lie, stupid and small. Like I had missed something obvious that everyone else could see. My fingers hovered over the call button on my phone, just for a second, because that's what mothers do. We call, we ask, we beg, we try to understand, but something stopped me. A quiet voice inside that said, don't, not yet, because the way he wrote that message, so final, so careless, told me something important. He wasn't afraid, he thought it was over, he thought he had won, and I sat back in my chair. Closed my eyes and let out a slow breath, my hands still trembling, my stomach hollow, and I made a decision right there at that table. A decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to chase him. I wasn't going to cry in front of anyone, I was going to be silent, because silence makes people careless. Silence makes them reveal things, and he didn't know it yet, but the account he emptied wasn't just mine. There was a detail he had overlooked, a detail that would turn his perfect wedding into the beginning of his worst nightmare. And before I tell you what that detail was, let me ask you something honestly. If your own child betrayed you like this, would you react with emotion, or would you stay quiet and think? And if stories like this feel real to you, if they make your chest tighten because you know it could happen to anyone, make sure you stay with this channel. Because these aren't just stories, they're warnings, and I promise you, this is only the beginning, because while my son thought he had erased my future overnight, he had no idea that every move he made was already leading him straight into consequences he couldn't escape. And in the next part of this story, you'll see exactly how a lifetime of trust turned into the calm before a very serious storm. So stay with me, because silence was my first weapon. When people hear what my son did, they often ask the same question, their heads tilted, voices soft, but how did he become like that? And every time I hear it, I feel that slow ache in my chest again. Because no one raises a child thinking this will be the ending. No mother looks at a baby and imagines betrayal. I remember the day he was born, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like I was the whole world. and for years I was. I stayed up through fevers, packed lunches, attended school meetings, laughed when he scraped his knees and cried harder than he did. His father and I weren't perfect, but we were present, and when my husband was alive, our home was full, noisy. Messy in a good way, dinner conversations, weekend chores, small arguments that ended in laughter, and my son grew up knowing he was loved, deeply, unquestioningly, maybe too unquestioningly, because looking back now, I see the pattern forming quietly, almost politely. He was praised often, protected often, rescued often when he failed a class. We blamed the teacher when he broke something. We paid for it when he struggled. We stepped in before life could teach him its sharper lessons. Haha, we called it love back then. After all, what parent wants to see their child suffer? And when he went off to college, we were proud, so proud. We helped with tuition, rent, books, a car, because that's what good parents do, right? You help when you can. And when my husband died suddenly, everything shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but like a slow change in the weather. The house became quieter. My grief sat with me at the table every morning, and my son, he pulled away, not cruelly, just conveniently. His calls became shorter, his visits less frequent, and when he did show up, there was often a reason. A problem that needed fixing. Mom, I'm short on rent. Mom, my car needs repairs. Mom, can you help just this once? And I always said yes, always, because in my mind, helping him meant staying connected. It meant I was still needed, and I didn't realize then how dangerous that thought can be, how love can quietly turn into permission to take, to expect, to assume, and then she entered his life, the woman he would later marry. And the first time I met her, I smiled, I was polite, I told myself to be open-minded, but something about her made my shoulders tense without explanation. Her smile was perfect but empty, like it had been practiced. And when she looked around my home, her eyes didn't wander with curiosity, they measured, counted, evaluated. Haha. At the time I thought I was being unfair, judgmental even, but instincts don't shout, they whisper. And I ignored that whisper because it felt easier to be kind than cautious. She talked often about dreams, about wanting more, about feeling entitled to a better life, and my son nodded along, repeating her words later as if they were his own. Slowly, almost invisibly, his questions changed. He stopped asking how I was and started asking how I was doing financially. You're okay, right, Mom? He'd say, you're managing. And I answered honestly, yes, I was fine, secure even. And I didn't realize that every answer was a piece of information, every reassurance a green light, and then there were the small moments that didn't make sense until later, the way he'd linger near my desk, the way papers would shift, the way conversations about money felt too casual, too curious, but again, I told myself I was imagining things, because it's easier to doubt yourself than to doubt your child. Especially when the world keeps reminding you that you're getting older, that memory fades, that confusion is expected. Sigh, I even joked once, maybe I'm just getting forgetful, and he laughed a little too quickly, a little too comfortably. And now that laugh echoes in my head because that's when I understand it clearly. He wasn't planning violence, he wasn't acting out of rage, he was planning entitlement, carefully, patiently. Building a story where taking from me felt justified, where my age became his excuse, where love became leverage, and the worst part is this, I helped him believe it, every time I fixed a problem he created. Every time I said yes instead of no, every time I chose peace over boundaries, I was teaching him something without meaning to, that my role was to give and his role was to take, and when you teach someone that long enough, they stop seeing it as kindness and start seeing it as theirs by right. I sit with that truth often now, not to punish myself, but to understand how quietly things can go wrong, how betrayal rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with comfort, with assumptions, with the belief that someone will never say stop. And as I sat alone after reading that message, replaying years in my head, one thought kept returning, steady and unsettling. This didn't happen overnight. The theft was sudden, yes, but the mindset behind it had been growing for years, watered by love without limits. And while I sat there trying to untangle where I went wrong, they were already celebrating, already believing the story was finished. But what they didn't know, what no one had considered yet, was that the very habits that made me a careful saver, a quiet woman, a detail-oriented mind, were about to work against them, because while they thought my age made me weak, it had actually made me observant, and in the next stretch of this story, you'll see the exact moment when small, strange details stopped feeling random and started forming a picture that made my blood run cold. Because once I saw that picture clearly, there was no going back. There's a strange moment that happens before you realize you've been fooled, a moment where things feel wrong but not wrong enough to panic, and that's the most dangerous place to be, because your brain keeps trying to explain everything away. Haha, I remember thinking back to the weeks before the money disappeared and how ordinary they felt at the time, how boring even, yet now they replay in my head like warning lights I refused to see. It started small. Always small because big changes scare people, but small ones slip past quietly. One afternoon, I couldn't find my checkbook where I always kept it, same drawer, same folder. I searched calmly at first. Then, with growing irritation, and finally I found it tucked between cookbooks in the kitchen, which made no sense at all. I laughed it off, told myself I must have moved it while cleaning, even though I never cleaned with my checkbook. Sigh, but doubt is easy to swallow when the alternative feels painful. Then my bank statements stopped arriving in the mail. Weeks passed and nothing came, no envelopes, no alerts, and when I finally called the bank, the woman on the phone sounded confused, almost annoyed. "Ma'am, you changed your mailing address 2 weeks ago," she said, and my stomach dropped. "No, I didn't," I replied, laughing nervously like this was a silly misunderstanding. But she insisted, told me the request was done in person, signed and approved, and that's when the first real wave of fear washed over me, cold and sharp, because I hadn't stepped inside that bank in months. I hung up the phone and just sat there staring at the wall, my heart racing, trying to piece together how something like this could happen without me knowing, and instead of reacting logically, I did what so many people my age are trained to do. I blamed myself. Maybe I forgot, maybe I misunderstood, maybe my memory really is slipping, and that thought hurt more than anything else because it made me feel small. Unreliable, like I had lost ownership of my own life, and then my son started asking questions, casual questions, the kind that sound caring on the surface. "Mom, are you managing okay? Your pension's still enough. You sure you don't need help with finances?" And I remember feeling a strange mix of comfort and irritation. Comfort because he sounded involved again. Irritation because the questions felt new, invasive even, but I brushed that aside too, because when a child pretends to worry, it feels ungrateful to question their motives. Haha, I see it clearly now, but at the time, all I saw was my son showing interest after months of distance, and then there were moments with her, his girlfriend, moments I didn't understand until much later, the way she watched me type on my laptop. The way she commented on my house, my savings, my comfortable life, always with that same soft voice that never quite reached her eyes, and once I caught her staring at my purse for just a second too long. I even remember thinking that was odd and then immediately scolding myself for being suspicious, because society teaches older women to doubt themselves first, not others, and the more I replay those days, the more I realize how carefully everything was arranged. Like furniture being moved 1 inch at a time so you don't notice the room changing, conversations steered gently toward money, my age mentioned often enough to plant a seed, little jokes about memory, about confusion, about helping mom stay organized, and each time I smiled, nodded, accepted the narrative they were quietly building around me, that I was still sweet, still kind, but maybe not fully aware, and once that story exists, everything else becomes easier for people like them. I didn't know then that someone had already walked into my bank pretending to be me, that someone had practiced my posture, my voice, my signature. That someone had planned this with patience and nerve, and while all of that was happening, I was still cooking dinner, still watering plants, still living in the illusion that my biggest problem was loneliness, not betrayal. Sigh, what hurts the most isn't the theft itself, it's the realization that I was being watched, studied, measured by people I trusted, that my habits were turned into tools against me, my politeness mistaken for weakness, my quiet life mistaken for ignorance, and when I finally allowed myself to stop blaming my memory and start asking harder questions, something shifted inside me. The fear didn't disappear, but it sharpened, turned into focus. I started replaying every detail, every comment, every missing paper, every strange phone call, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't random, this wasn't an accident, this was preparation. And the scariest part was realizing how close I had come to dismissing it all, to letting it go, to convincing myself I was just an old woman getting confused, because that's exactly what they were counting on. And as I sat there piecing it together, my hands cold, my jaw tight, one thought became painfully clear. They didn't just take my money, they tried to take my credibility, my voice, my ability to be believed. And once someone tries to erase that from you, they're capable of far worse. And while they were busy celebrating, convinced the story was over, I was finally seeing the full picture. And that picture told me something I couldn't ignore anymore. The theft wasn't the beginning, it was the middle. And the next thing I needed to do would decide whether I stayed silent forever, or turn their careful plan into the biggest mistake of their lives. There's a moment when excitement feels wrong, when joy shows up wearing the wrong face, and that's exactly how I felt when my son appeared at my door that afternoon, smiling too wide, moving too fast. Like someone rushing through lines they'd rehearsed. Haha, he didn't even sit down properly before announcing it. "Mom, we have amazing news," and my heart should have lifted. That's what mothers are trained to feel, but instead it sank. Heavy and slow because his excitement didn't feel warm, it felt sharp, hurried, almost desperate. And when he said they were getting married the very next day, my mind stumbled over the words like they didn't fit together. Tomorrow. Just like that, no planning, no family, no pause, and I remember forcing a smile, nodding like I was happy for him while my stomach twisted into a knot. Because love doesn't usually rush like that unless it's running from something. Sai, his girlfriend, bounced beside him, squealing about romance, about Vegas, about fresh starts, her voice high and theatrical, and all I could think was how little eye contact she made with me. How her hands kept gripping her bag like she was afraid it might disappear, and when I asked gentle questions, the kind meant to slow things down, "Don't you want a proper wedding?" "Let me help," my son shut them down quickly. Too quickly, his tone firm in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager arguing about curfews. And then he added something that made my chest tighten even more, that they were leaving the state, not sure where yet, maybe Arizona. Maybe California, just gone, as if geography was an afterthought, as if roots were inconveniences, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the walls closer, because leaving like that didn't sound like a dream, it sounded like an escape. And when they finally left, the house felt colder than it had in years. I sat on the couch staring at the door long after it closed, replaying every word, every smile, every rushed excuse, and that night I barely slept. My mind wouldn't quiet down, thoughts looping over and over, something is wrong, something is very wrong, but I still didn't know what, not yet, and when morning came, I moved through my routine like I was underwater, slow, detached. My hands trembling just slightly as I opened my laptop, still hoping, foolishly, that the unease would dissolve into embarrassment, that I'd laugh at myself later for being dramatic, but instead, the screen loaded and confirmed my worst fear. The number stared back at me, small, final, cruel, and in that moment, the rushed wedding, the sudden move, the strange questions, all of it snapped into place like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to see completed. My entire life savings was gone, siphoned away quietly while I was worrying about loneliness and tea getting cold, and before I could even breathe, the text arrived, cold and careless, goodbye packaged as convenience. And I felt something inside me harden, not into anger yet, but into clarity, because weddings are supposed to mark beginnings, not endings, and his announcement hadn't been about love, it had been about timing, about distraction. About making sure I was looking the other way while everything was taken from me, and as I sat there staring at the screen, my hands shaking, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes right before a storm. Because he thought the wedding was his escape, his clean ending, but he had no idea that his big day was about to become the point where everything unraveled, and as painful as it was to accept, one truth rang louder than all the others. This wasn't impulsive, it was planned, and once I understood that, I knew there was no going back to pretending this was just a misunderstanding, because the night before his wedding wasn't just when he left me behind. It was when he crossed a line that would change all of our lives forever. People imagine that when you lose everything, you collapse, that you scream or fall apart in some dramatic way, but that's not what happened to me, not at first, because shock doesn't explode, it settles, heavy and quiet like fog. And after reading that message from my son, I just sat there, staring at the screen, my tea going cold beside me, my hands resting uselessly in my lap, my mind kept trying to rewind time. To find the moment where this could still be a mistake, a glitch, something reversible, so I logged out of my bank account and logged back in again, haha, as if technology might suddenly apologize and fix itself. But the number stayed the same, brutally small. And that's when my chest tightened enough that I had to put my hand over my heart and breathe slowly, in through my nose, out through my mouth. The way I used to do when my son was little and had nightmares, except this time I was the one trying not to panic. I stood up, paced the kitchen, sat back down, paced again, my legs feeling weak, my head buzzing, and still I didn't cry. Tears hovered there, burning, but they refused to fall because somewhere deep inside me, something had switched off, the part that reacts, the part that begs, the part that pleads for mercy, and in its place was a strange, icy awareness, this is real. This already happened and crying won't undo it. I picked up my phone again, read his text once more, slower this time, and the words hurt in a different way now, not just because of the theft, but because of the tone, the finality. Live however you want, as if my life was already over, as if I was just an inconvenience he was stepping over on his way to something better, and that hurt more than the money, because money can be counted, replaced even. But that sentence told me how he saw me, disposable, finished, irrelevant, and my throat finally tightened enough that a sound escaped. A small, broken sob I didn't recognize as my own. I wiped my face quickly, angry at myself for letting it show even in an empty room, and then I did something that surprised even me. I put the phone down and did nothing, no calls, no messages, no frantic driving to the bank, just silence. Because instinct told me that reacting right away would only give him what he expected, panic, emotion, weakness, and I wasn't going to hand that to him. I needed time to think, to breathe, to understand what I was dealing with. And as I sat there, memories began flooding in uninvited. My husband carefully explaining the life insurance policy years ago, promising me I'd always be safe, my own discipline, years of saving. of saying no to small pleasures so I could say yes to peace later, and realizing all of that had been wiped away with a few signatures and a wire transfer made me feel hollow, like the floor had dropped out from under me. But even in that hollow space, something stubborn remained, a quiet refusal to disappear, and that's when I remembered something important, something small but powerful, something my son had never paid attention to. The account he emptied wasn't just mine, it was set up years ago with my sister's name on it too, not because I planned for betrayal, but because life had taught me to prepare for emergencies, and suddenly my breathing slowed. Not because I was calm, but because I saw a path, thin and fragile but real, and before I followed it, I needed to be absolutely sure of what happened, sure of who was involved, sure that this wasn't just greed but fraud. So I opened a notebook and started writing dates, conversations, strange moments, every detail I could remember, my handwriting shaky at first, then steadier, line by line, and as I wrote, the fog in my head began to lift. The fear giving way to focus, and halfway through that long, painful process, I realized something else. If you're listening to this and thinking it sounds unreal, like something that could never happen to you, please understand this: it happens quietly. It happens inside families, it happens when love is used as cover, and if stories like this matter to you, if you want to hear what really happens when people finally stop staying silent, make sure you stay with this channel. Because this story isn't about money anymore, it's about what happens when someone underestimates you. And as I closed that notebook, wiped my eyes, and took a deep breath, one truth settled firmly in my chest. My son thought my silence meant defeat, but silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy, and the next call I made would change the entire direction of this story. There's a point where fear stops being loud and starts being useful, and that moment came for me when I finally picked up the phone, not to call my son, not to confront anyone, but to call the one person who knew me well enough to hear the truth in my voice, my sister. And even before she answered, my hands were shaking again, not wildly. Just that quiet tremor that comes when you're stepping onto ground you know will never feel the same again. Sigh, she answered on the second ring, sleepy, confused, and I didn't ease into it, I didn't know how. So I just said her name and then said, "Something is very wrong," and the tone of my voice must have carried everything because she was fully awake in an instant, asking questions, telling me to breathe, telling me to start from the beginning. And as I explained, slowly at first and then all at once, the missing money, the text, the rushed wedding, the silence, I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line. And when I finally told her the balance, how almost everything was gone. She didn't try to comfort me the way people usually do. She didn't say, "It'll be okay," or "Maybe there's a mistake." Instead, she said something far more grounding: "Check the joint account," and for a second I just froze. Because I had almost forgotten, not out of denial, but because that account had always been a backup, an afterthought, something we set up years ago in case of emergencies, and suddenly this was the emergency it had been waiting for. I logged in while she stayed on the line, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, my heart racing again, and when the page loaded, the balance confirmed everything. The money was gone from there too, but so was any doubt. Because my sister was listed as a co-owner, and that changed everything. Her voice hardened then, sharp and clear in a way only someone who understands systems and consequences can sound. She said words I hadn't allowed myself to say yet: "This isn't just betrayal, this is fraud," and hearing it out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but it also felt honest. And honesty has a strange way of steadying you. She explained calmly that because her name was on the account, she had full legal standing to ask questions, to demand records, to walk into the bank and be taken seriously. And as she spoke, my fear began to rearrange itself into something more structured, less chaotic, because suddenly I wasn't alone in this. Suddenly there was someone else who could see the pattern clearly without the weight of motherhood blurring the edges. And when she said she would go to the bank in person that same day, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because action was finally happening, dread because once professionals got involved, there would be no pretending this was a misunderstanding anymore. And after we hung up, I sat very still, listening to the clock tick on the wall, every second sounding louder than the last, knowing that somewhere my son was probably laughing, celebrating, believing the story was finished, while a quiet chain of events had already started moving against him. And when my sister called back hours later, her voice was different, heavier. She didn't waste time. She told me the truth straight. The transfer was done in person 3 days earlier, the paperwork existed, the signatures were there, and there was security footage. And when she said those last words, something inside me went completely still. Because footage doesn't forget, it doesn't get confused, it doesn't age, it just records. And when she told me who was on that footage, who had walked into the bank pretending to be me, my breath left my body in one long exhale. Not because I was surprised, but because the last piece had fallen into place. It wasn't my son standing there, it was his bride, wearing a disguise, copying my look, my posture, my name, and in that moment, The betrayal took on a different shape, sharper, colder, because this wasn't impulsive greed. It was rehearsal, planning, confidence, and as my sister explained how the bank was already preparing internal reports, how they would cooperate fully with any investigation, how this could become much bigger than a family argument, I felt something rise in my chest that I hadn't felt since the morning it all happened. Control, not power, not revenge. Just the solid sense that the truth had weight, and once truth enters the room, lies start to panic. And while I thanked my sister and told her to gather everything, every document, every record, every frame of footage, I realized something quietly. My silence had worked. They thought I was weak, distracted, old. But while they were celebrating a wedding, I was building a timeline, and as I hung up the phone, staring at the same kitchen table where this nightmare had begun, one thought echoed louder than the rest. They didn't just steal from a mother, they committed a crime, and once the law gets involved, love stops protecting you. And in the next stretch of this story, you'll hear exactly what happens when people who think they're untouchable realize they've left evidence everywhere. There's a strange power in letting someone believe they've won, and once the truth settled in my chest, once the fear turned into focus, I understood that my next move wasn't action, it was patience. Haha, I didn't call my son. Didn't text him, didn't confront anyone, because people who think they're safe get careless, and carelessness leaves trails, so I went about my days quietly, answering polite messages from neighbors, watering my plants, making simple meals. All while a different kind of awareness hummed under everything, and then my phone rang, my son's name lighting up the screen like nothing had happened, like he hadn't emptied my life and walked away smiling, and I answered, my voice steady, almost warm, and he sounded happy, relaxed, the way people do when they believe the worst is behind them. He talked about the wedding, the hotel, the view, the plans, laughed a little, and I listened, nodded, even congratulated him. Sigh, every word tasting bitter in my mouth, but I let it sit there because my silence made him comfortable, made him careless, and he started talking too much, mentioning places, timelines, spending plans, and while he spoke, I learned more than he realized, learned how confident he was that I wouldn't fight back, how certain he was that motherhood meant forgiveness no matter what, and when the call ended, I didn't feel weak, I felt clear. Because pretending was harder than reacting, but far more effective, and while he was posting smiling photos online, showing off champagne glasses and hotel views, my sister was gathering documents, copies, confirmations. Each one a quiet brick being stacked against them, and every hour that passed without confrontation made them bolder, more public, more careless, until there was no doubt left at all, and as I watched it unfold, I understood something deeply unsettling. Betrayal doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like confidence, like entitlement, like someone smiling while standing on what they think is solid ground, not knowing it's about to collapse, and that's when I knew, truly knew, that the moment I finally spoke, it wouldn't be to argue, it would be to end the illusion they were living in, because silence isn't weakness when it's chosen, it's pressure. And pressure always finds the cracks. There's a moment when quiet preparation turns into movement, and that moment arrived without drama, without shouting, without warning, just a decision followed by action. And I remember thinking how strange it was that my life could change again on an ordinary weekday morning. Sigh, I put on my coat, picked up a folder my sister had prepared, thick with papers that felt heavier than their weight, and walked into the police station with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. My heart was beating fast, yes, but my hands were steady, steadier than they had been in days, because fear had finally been replaced by certainty. And certainty is grounding. I explained everything slowly, carefully, not as a grieving mother, but as a person reporting facts, dates, signatures, footage, transfers, and the officer listening to me didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. Just nodded as the picture became clear, and when he finally leaned back and said, "This is serious," I felt an odd sense of relief, not joy, not satisfaction, just relief that someone else could now see what I saw. That this wasn't imagination or age or confusion. It was real, and once the report was filed, the machine started moving in ways I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. Banks were contacted, accounts flagged, transfers frozen. And while all of that was happening quietly, somewhere far away my son was still living inside his illusion, believing silence meant surrender, and then the calls started, first one, then another, then several in a row. His name lighting up my phone again, and this time I didn't answer because now silence wasn't strategy, it was distance, and the messages followed quickly. Confusion turning into panic. Mom, why is my account frozen? There must be a mistake, can you call me? And with each message, I felt something tighten and then loosen inside my chest because panic has a sound and I could hear it in his words. The confidence from earlier gone, replaced by fear, and then there was her, his wife, posting online long rambling messages about betrayal and lies, about an evil old woman trying to ruin their happiness. Sigh, reading it hurt. I won't pretend it didn't, but it also confirmed something important. People who are innocent don't shout like that, they don't rewrite reality in public, they don't try to shame the truth into disappearing. And when my phone finally rang with his voice breaking through, raw and angry, accusing me of destroying his life, I listened quietly until he ran out of words, and then I said the only thing that mattered: you stole from me. And the silence that followed was heavy, thick, because for the first time I wasn't playing along, I wasn't comforting or pretending, I was naming what he did, and once a thing is named, it can't hide anymore. And while he yelled, while she threatened, while they tried to twist the story back into something that painted them as victims, the law kept moving forward, slow but unstoppable, and I understood then that consequences don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive with paperwork, with frozen accounts, with doors closing quietly one by one. And as I sat there later that night, alone again in my kitchen, the same place where this had begun, I felt exhausted, hollow, but also strangely upright, like I had finally stood up straight after being bent for too long, because no matter how loudly they protested now, no matter how angry or scared they became, the truth was already out of their control. And in the next part of this story, you'll see how far they were willing to go once they realized silence was no longer protecting them, because when people lose money, they panic, but when they lose control, they reveal who they really are. They showed up when I least expected it, and somehow when I'd been bracing myself all along, because fear has a way of announcing itself before it arrives, a tight feeling in the chest, a quiet warning you try to ignore. And that afternoon I felt it the moment I saw the unfamiliar car slow down in front of my house. I was in the garden, my hands in the soil, doing something ordinary to remind myself that life still existed beyond phone calls and documents, and when the car stopped and the doors opened, my heart dropped. There they were, my son and his wife, standing on my driveway like they belonged there, like they hadn't shattered every boundary already, and for a second I just stood frozen, dirt on my hands, sunlight in my eyes, thinking they're not supposed to be here. And that thought alone told me how far things had gone, because when family becomes something you fear, you know something has broken beyond repair. My son spoke first, his voice softer than I'd heard it in weeks. "Mom, we just want to talk." And that word talk almost made me laugh, because talking was what they'd avoided when honesty mattered, and now they wanted it when consequences had arrived. I told them calmly to leave, that they weren't allowed to contact me, that everything now had to go through lawyers, but they didn't move, and that's when I saw it clearly, the desperation in their eyes, the thin smile she was wearing stretched tight over something sharp and angry underneath, and against my better judgment, against every sensible thought, I agreed to a few minutes on the porch, not because I trusted them, but because part of me needed to see them as they truly were, not as the people I remembered. We sat down. The same chairs my husband and I once shared coffee in, and the weight of that irony pressed hard on my chest. My son spoke about regret, about pressure, about mistakes, about love, his words tumbling over each other like he was trying to outrun the truth, and she nodded along, adding apologies that felt rehearsed, polished. And as I listened, something strange happened. I felt detached, like I was watching strangers perform a scene meant to move me, but the emotions never came, because apologies offered only after consequences aren't apologies, they're strategies. And when I said plainly that returning the money now didn't erase what they had done, her mask slipped just for a second, and the woman underneath looked nothing like the one pretending to be sorry. She stood up, her voice sharp, accusing me of cruelty, of revenge, of wanting power, and my son joined in, his voice rising, asking what kind of mother sends her child to prison. And for the first time, I answered without hesitation, without tears, without doubt. What kind of son steals his mother's life and walks away smiling? And the silence that followed felt final, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. She stepped closer then, too close, her words turning ugly, personal, calling me bitter, old, alone, promising I would regret this. And strangely, that didn't scare me, it clarified everything, because people reveal their true selves when they're no longer getting what they want, and in that moment, I saw them both clearly, not as family, not as victims, but as people who believed love meant immunity. And when I told them to leave again, this time with my hand already on my phone, they finally did. Tires screeching as they pulled away, and I stood there long after they were gone, my legs shaking, my heart pounding, not from fear but from the adrenaline of finality, because something inside me had settled permanently. The hope that this could be fixed, that apologies could undo betrayal, that motherhood required endless sacrifice, all of it dissolved right there on that porch. And as I went back inside and locked the door behind me, I understood one last painful truth: this wasn't going to end quietly, not for them, not after threats, not after intimidation, not after trying to rewrite reality face to face. And in the next part of this story, you'll see what happens when truth finally steps into a courtroom, where stories don't matter, tears don't work, and evidence speaks louder than blood ever could. I always imagined a courtroom would feel dramatic, heavy with noise and tension, but the truth is it felt quiet, almost ordinary, and that somehow made it harder to breathe. Because ordinary rooms are where life-changing decisions actually happen. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening as facts replaced stories, dates replaced emotions, documents replaced excuses. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't being asked how I felt, I was being shown what was true. And across the room my son looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his eyes searching for mine and not finding comfort there anymore. And beside him she sat stiff and angry, no softness left, no apology left, just calculation, and when the judge spoke, her voice calm and firm. Something settled in my chest, not relief, not victory, but acceptance, because consequences were finally real, not abstract threats or angry messages, but words that couldn't be taken back, sentences that carried weight. And when it was over, when the room emptied and the sound of it all faded, I realized I was trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes after carrying something too heavy for too long. And a few days later, the money returned, every dollar that had been taken, sitting back in my account like it had never left, and I stared at the number for a long time, waiting to feel whole again, but something surprising happened. I didn't feel joy, I didn't cry, I just felt quiet, because money coming back doesn't rewind time, it doesn't restore trust, it doesn't turn a son back into who he was supposed to be. And that grief sat with me longer than I expected, heavier than the fear ever had. Haha, people congratulated me, called me brave, strong, told me I'd won, but winning didn't feel like the right word, surviving did. Because what I really lost wasn't just peace, it was the idea that love alone could protect you. And over time, slowly, life found new shapes, new routines, quieter but steadier ones, mornings where I drank my tea without dread, evenings where I slept without checking my phone, conversations that didn't revolve around fear or guilt, and I learned something important in that calm, something I wish I'd understood earlier: love without boundaries isn't love, it's permission. And permission can destroy you if you let it. I don't hate my son, and that truth surprised me too. Hatred takes energy I no longer want to give, but I also don't excuse what he did. Because accountability is the only thing that gives wrongdoing meaning, and if you're listening to this and wondering what you would do in my place, wondering if staying silent means being kind, let me tell you this gently. Silence can be strength, but only when it leads you toward truth, not away from it. And if stories like mine matter to you, if you believe real life lessons deserve to be heard, stay with this channel. Because these stories aren't about revenge, they're about survival. And before I end this, I want to leave you with one thought: age doesn't make you weak, experience makes you dangerous to lies. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't forgiving, it's standing still, speaking clearly, and refusing to disappear. Thank you for listening, truly, and if this story touched something inside you, don't ignore it. Because the moment you start trusting your voice again, everything changes.